In the quiet hum of a small-town diner, the last thing anyone expected was chaos. An elderly black veteran, dressed in his Sunday best, walked in for nothing more than a cup of coffee and peace. But what followed was a storm of arrogance, prejudice, and shocking disrespect that left the entire room frozen. A hot-headed bully, blinded by his own hate, crossed a line he could never uncross. What he didn't know, what no one in that diner realized, was that this man's son held one of the most powerful positions in the country, and justice was already on its way. The diner sat on the corner of Main Street, a familiar place where locals gathered for coffee, gossip, and comfort food. Its red leather booths and checkered floor carried decades of history, echoing laughter and stories of generations past. On this particular afternoon, the sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the room. Regulars chatted over half-empty mugs while the waitress hummed along to an old jukebox tune. It felt like an ordinary day, one that should have passed without incident. The door creaked open, and in stepped a man who commanded quiet dignity without saying a word. He was an elderly black veteran, his back straight despite his age, his hands steady though worn by years of service. His presence was unassuming, yet his sharp eyes reflected a life of resilience. He chose a booth near the window, hoping only for a meal in peace. To some, he was just another customer. To others who recognized him, he was a symbol of quiet strength, a man who had sacrificed for the very freedoms others took for granted. But peace is fragile, and prejudice has a way of finding its target. Across the diner sat a man known less for his manners and more for his temper. Loud, brash, and eager to be noticed, he thrived on making others uncomfortable. He watched the veteran with a look that carried more than curiosity. It carried disdain. The hum of the diner continued, but beneath it, an uneasy tension began to build. The veteran quietly stirred his coffee, the small spoon clinking against the porcelain cup in steady rhythm. For him, this was supposed to be a moment of calm. But to the bully across the room, his very presence was an invitation for cruelty. It started small, snide whispers too low for most to hear, the scrape of a chair dragged deliberately against the floor as the bully shifted his weight, and the smirk that curled across his face. He muttered to the man beside him, loud enough this time to carry through the air, "Some folks don't belong here." The words weren't addressed directly, but the target was clear. The veteran didn't react. He had weathered worse storms than this, both on the battlefield and at home. Silence was his shield. But in a world hungry for conflict, silence can sometimes fuel the aggressor's fire. The bully grew bolder, making a show of his disdain. He swaggered across the room, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. Patrons lowered their eyes, pretending to be lost in their meals. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to be next. Standing by the veteran's booth, the bully leaned in close, violating the space with a sneer. His voice dripped venom, calling out the man's age, his skin, his very right to sit there. Each word landed like a stone, designed not to wound the body, but to cut at dignity. The veteran's hands remained steady, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped his cup. His composure was both admirable and haunting. He had lived through battles most men couldn't imagine, fighting for a country that now allowed men like this to taunt him in public. Still, he chose restraint. But the bully wasn't finished. Frustrated by the lack of reaction, he reached out, striking the cup from the veteran's hand. Coffee spilled across the table, dripping onto the floor in dark streams. The diner fell into silence. The waitress froze mid-step. A family at the corner booth held their breath, and every eye shifted toward the unfolding confrontation. The veteran looked up, his gaze calm but firm, refusing to give the satisfaction of fear. And that look, the unspoken defiance in his eyes, was what pushed the bully over the edge. With a sudden movement, fueled by arrogance and prejudice, he struck the man across the face. Gasps rippled through the room. Some stood halfway as though they might intervene but hesitated. Fear anchored them to their seats. No one wanted to face the wrath of a man already proven violent. What none of them knew, what the bully himself couldn't have imagined, was that justice was already closer than he thought. For the elderly man was not alone in this world. His son, a man whose authority stretched far beyond the walls of this small-town diner, was only moments away from learning what had happened. And when he did, everything would change. The sting of that slap echoed louder than the jukebox, louder than the clatter of cutlery suddenly frozen mid-air. Time itself seemed to pause. The elderly veteran did not cry out, did not collapse. He simply lifted his head slowly, his jaw tight, his cheek reddened by violence he did not deserve. That silence, unyielding, unbroken, was more powerful than any retaliation. It left the bully unsettled, his bravado momentarily cracked. Then came the sound of the diner's door creaking open. Sunlight spilled across the floor, framing a tall figure whose presence shifted the air instantly. It was the veteran's son, a man few in that small town truly knew. He wasn't simply successful. He held one of the most formidable roles in the nation, Head of Homeland Security. Conversations died, chairs scraped back. Patrons who moments ago cowered now straightened, sensing a shift of power they could neither predict nor control. The bully, still flushed with arrogance, didn't yet understand the gravity of what he had done. He barked out another insult, half to cover his own fear. But the words hung uselessly, lost against the commanding aura of the man now standing only steps away. The son's gaze fell first on his father, the veteran, still composed despite the humiliation, and then on the aggressor. It was a look that carried both professional authority and something far deeper, personal wrath. This was no longer a stranger's fight. This was blood. The room seemed to contract, every heartbeat amplified. The bully's smirk faltered, his swagger eroding as whispers broke out among the bystanders. Recognition spread like wildfire. Homeland Security. The man he had just struck was no ordinary target, and the witness to his cruelty was someone with the power to make consequences absolute. In that instant, the bully's dominance disintegrated. The balance of power had flipped entirely, and for the first time that day, fear belonged to him. The bully's arrogance melted into panic as reality set in. The man he had mocked, the man he had struck, was no faceless stranger. And standing before him now was someone who embodied authority far greater than fists or bravado. The diner, once hushed by fear, now felt charged with anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see if justice would finally meet cruelty. The son moved closer, not with shouts or threats, but with calm, commanding presence. His voice, low and measured, carried more weight than anger ever could. He didn't need to raise a hand. The truth of who he was and what he represented was enough to shatter the bully's defiance. The waitress, trembling, whispered into her phone. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived, though their demeanor shifted the moment they recognized the Homeland Security chief in their midst. The bully was no longer a loud man in a diner. He was a criminal, handcuffed and led out under the gaze of every silent witness. The veteran remained seated, dignified despite the red mark on his face embodying a resilience no one could take from him. His son placed a steady hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture, both protective and reverent. For the first time since the confrontation began, the room exhaled, but what lingered was more than relief. It was reflection. Every patron in that diner had seen how quickly silence can enable hate, how prejudice thrives when unchecked, and how fragile dignity can seem in the face of cruelty. Yet they also saw the other side, the unshakable strength of a man who refused to be broken, and the power of justice when wielded without hesitation. The bully left in disgrace, but the lesson remained. Hate may shout the loudest in a room, but it is never the strongest force there. So the question echoes beyond the walls of that diner. When you witness injustice, will you stay silent, or will you stand on the side of what's right?